It always was just a weight crushing in my heart. Someone is out there and they're after me. The paranoia was definitely building up. I could be playing a football game and just think someone might be waiting outside the gates after the game to try to take me.
I didn't really know who they were and what their intentions were. It was just constant worry that I was going to be exposed. My fears were coming to life. Because of these actions, some of the lives are no longer with us today.
It gave me feelings of anger. I wish I could find who this person is and make them stop. My name is Grant Avens. In 2012, I was 15 years old and just finished my freshman year of high school. It was such a fun summer. It was one of the most fun summers of my life. You're starting to grow up, but you're not old enough to have responsibilities of a real job and things like that. We had the whole summer break to stay in shape and be ready for the next sports season. I played 5 sports and made it on the varsity team for each of those. I was probably the best shape in my life. My friend group was not just athletic. I kind of got along with everybody and didn't like to just stick to one group. I kind of bounced around. I used Facebook as a way to stay in touch with my friends all summer long. So when we got friend requests, I was pretty generous with accepting them, as long as they had at least 1 or 2 mutual friends feel that someone thought I was good looking enough to do a photo shoot. I had never really thought about modeling seriously. At the time, I was mainly just intrigued by the cash. I was saving up for my college education, and pretty much every penny that I earned would go into a college savings account that I had no access to. And so the appeal of this photo shoot was that if I could get $500 in cash, well, then I could have some spending money. I knew if my mom knew I made $500 that she would want me to put it in my college savings account. So I didn't want to tell my parents about the photo shoot.
My name is Tommy Wita. I was at Rosemont High School. Yeah, this is me. I was 17, my junior year on the high school football team. So I played football and baseball. I took a lot of pride in my physique because I just knew if I missed a day working out, somebody else would step up and they would take my spot. Survival of the fittest. That summer, I was working at this place called Crown Rental. There's a lot of people renting out tables and chairs and tents for graduation parties and weddings. So it was a pretty physical job, helped me stay in shape as well. My parents wanted me to develop a work ethic, and I also had to pay out of my own pocket for everything that I wanted, such as a phone or a car. Well, one day after work, I got a friend request from a young college graduate named Courtney Janskin. She was a very attractive woman. We got to speaking a bit over Messenger. She asked me if I wanted to get into modeling of any sorts, and I was down for it. Just getting offered for a one-time thing for $1,000, pretty enticing. I was awkward with girls back then in high school, so I was definitely flattered when she approached me.
Courtney explained that I had to fill out a questionnaire about my physical appearance from head to toe. She wanted really detailed answers, things like what are my eyebrow color in terms of the color scale, and what is my skin tone. Just really detailed, seem like legitimate questions that a modeling agency would want to ask on a questionnaire about their models. She said that the next step is that I just need to provide sample pictures, which basically prove that I am who I said I was in that questionnaire. She nonchalantly mentioned that they needed to be nude photographs, some with an erection, some with a non-erection. I was really taken back by that. Right away, she instantly responded that if there's no sexual nature in the photographs, that it's not child pornography. She was very reassuring about the practice and said that it was totally normal and something that all models have to do to get into the industry. I believed her, and she seemed professional, and I trusted her. Courtney definitely put a sense of urgency on moving the process along. So I was a little hesitant. It took me some time, but eventually I mustered up the courage to take the photographs.
When she asked for nude photographs, I really didn't think twice on it, I suppose. You know, it was a bit peculiar, I guess, for her. But I did it anyway without thinking, and just thought it was part of the process. I did not tell my parents. I actually grew up in a strict household, so I'm not sure if my parents would be accepting of, you know, me doing modeling or any kind of thing like that. So I pretty much just kept it to myself.
After I had sent the emails of my sample pictures to the modeling agency, Courtney said that I was approved as a model. She congratulated me on my sample pictures and then made a comment that surprised me. She said, "You have a nice and thick." I thought that Courtney was just trying to build my confidence by saying that. Courtney definitely expressed she was excited that I was getting established as a model. She was just really excited to get it scheduled and make the photo shoot happen. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, right before the photo shoot was supposed to happen, Courtney said that the photo shoot was actually going to be nude, fully nude. Well, here I was, 15 years old, about to start my sophomore year of high school, and had a nude photo shoot scheduled with a photographer I had never met. I decided that I would ask my girlfriend, who was older, to drive me to the studio. Right away, when I explained the situation to her, she got upset with me. Said, "What the heck, Grant? That's so weird. Why would you ever even consider doing that?" Said, "No way, absolutely not am I gonna help you get to this photo shoot." Definitely made me reconsider and think a little bit harder about what I was getting myself into. So finally, I messaged Courtney and told her that I wasn't gonna come to the photo shoot anymore and that she can delete my portfolio pictures. And I apologize for wasting her time. Courtney tried to push back and convince me otherwise. She didn't want to lose me as a model, but I established that I absolutely was not going to do the photo shoot. Courtney eventually accepted that and said that she would delete all my portfolio pictures and said best of luck. I felt like that was the end of my story with Courtney Janskin.
By October of my senior year, I hadn't yet done the modeling shoot, but Courtney did start to get more flirty, and she started to send photos of herself as well, nude. She was gorgeous, so, it was pretty exciting, yeah. It definitely boosted my confidence, the fact that she was older and she wasn't like the typical girl I would run into at high school. When she started sending me nudes, she would typically say that she wouldn't send anymore until I sent some more of me. I just started sending photos without thinking. She wanted nude photos of me flaccid or me erect.
My name is Courtney Lofgren. Courtney spelt with a K. In 2012, I was in my senior year at Rosemount High School. I got a message from Courtney Janskin on Facebook Messenger. She basically told me she was a scout and that she wants to build a portfolio of males and their nude photos. We're looking at the first messages that Courtney sent me, and basically, if I can refer anyone, I get $100 for each guy that does the shoot. Offering the money was something that made it sound more legit to me. Courtney came across as professional, so I started to go along with the conversation, and so I did start to provide some people's names that I was friends with. But for the most part, Courtney was interested in getting attractive teenage males who were well endowed. She said, "What guys have you heard are big? Or can you list other guys' sizes you know, even if they're not huge?" And then she also went on to say, "Yeah, I need like 7 inches personally, LOL. Unless he really knows what he's doing, then maybe 6 to 6.5, LOL. So it felt like she was really trying to get me to like talk about that stuff, talk about my thoughts on that. Talking about penis size amongst girls, especially in high school, I think was something that we gossiped about. So talking to Courtney was like talking to a friend. I wasn't very surprised that she was being upfront, just given the fact that she said she was working for a modeling agency. It just seemed like she was wanting to do her job.
In fall 2012, I was back at school as a sophomore. I got a friend request from a person named Dustin Michael. And I look at his profile and he looks like a high school hockey player. He started messaging me and I started talking to him. And then a couple days later, I was traveling with my soccer team and I got on the computer to check my Facebook, and I had messages from Dustin Michael offering to pay me $300 if I would let him perform oral sex on me. I was shocked. I was disgusted. I reacted a little angrily. I showed my teammates these messages and everyone was just like, WTF, what is going on? But we all kind of just brushed it off. So I pretty much just forgot about it and moved on.
As the school year went on, Courtney's and I's messages almost became one-sided. I would just keep asking the same question. When is this photo shoot gonna happen? When is this gonna happen? After a while, she just stopped answering my messages. I started to feel more vulnerable as time went on. I had the thought that maybe it could be somebody playing a prank on me, but I didn't really have friends that were that cruel. It was getting closer to my graduation, and it just kind of affected me really trusting people in general. It made me skeptical of anybody trying to add me on Facebook, and I ended up deleting the whole messaging feed I had with her because at that point I just felt truly embarrassed and wanted to just put it behind me, and I felt very stupid. I kind of figured it was it. I didn't hear anything from Courtney, and then after a while she deleted the original website. So at that point it was 1000% suspicious.
Courtney had mentioned some of the guys' names. She had said, "Oh, I have pictures of so-and-so." She asked me if I wanted to see the photographs. That's when I really started to question the legality of it. And I asked her, "Is this illegal?" And she said, "No. Why would this be illegal?" Courtney had said that the boys had given her consent. And that's when I started to think, does she actually have all these pictures that she's claiming to have? I decided to have Courtney send me the pictures to make sure she was telling the truth. I said, "Prove it." And she did. I opened it up, and it was one of my friends that he was butt naked, taking a selfie in the mirror. His face was showing, and he had an erect penis, and you could see everything. The guy's name was Tommy. When I saw the picture of Tommy, my stomach dropped. I knew that if she had the pictures of Tommy, then she had the pictures of the other guys that she had mentioned. I would be terrified if I knew that my pictures, my nude, very vulnerable pictures with my face in them, were being sent to people. So I immediately decided I had to tell Tommy, and I remember messaging him and saying, "Hey, this is gonna be kind of awkward, but I need to talk to you about something really important."
Courtney Lofgren contacted me and asked me if I knew of a name named Courtney Janskin. And at that point, my fears were coming to life. Courtney said that she had received some nude photos of me. I immediately felt an anxiety feeling that somebody I know has seen me naked. I started to think, who else is getting these photos? I felt like I just didn't have any control of the situation. Kind of felt like I was just in a hole by myself in a way. It was really tough.
Courtney ended up sending me nude pictures of 3 guys total.
When I realized that, it was impacting others, it was kind of a mixture of a sense of relief, but then also just a worry that they were going through the same thing.
I was on a summer vacation with my whole family down in Tennessee. We were staying at a lake, and I had a blast. And on the way back, I was riding in the car with my parents, my brother, and my grandma. And all of a sudden, I was checking my text messages, and I received a message from one of my soccer teammates. And right away, my heart just sank. I knew something was really wrong, and he responded with, and just seeing those words just crushed me. I just curled up into a little ball on the inside, but I knew I couldn't let my parents or my grandma or anybody see that I was feeling this. So I just kind of sat in the back of the car and just watched my hands shake, but instantly knew I had to do something. I had around 2,000 friends on Facebook who could all see any pictures that I get tagged in. The thought of all these people being able to see these naked pictures of me was devastating. The pictures were up for about 20 minutes before they were deleted. But 20 minutes is enough time for thousands of people to see. When I got back home, my first thought was that somehow Dustin Michael got the pictures from Courtney Janskin. So right away, I messaged Courtney and asked what the heck? Why were my pictures given to Dustin Michael? And she assured me that she didn't give them out. I definitely felt like I was being targeted by Dustin Michael because I didn't give in to what he wanted, which was to let him perform oral sex on me. I felt like there was someone out there targeting me and I just didn't know who it was. So I was too scared to reach out to the police. I thought I could get in trouble for this. From the perspective of a guy, it's difficult to talk about these issues. It's difficult to bring them up. My method of dealing with it was pretty much just move on, sweep it under the rug. Deep down, I was always worried that pictures would get posted again.
I knew I wanted to do something about it because when I realized that there were multiple people involved, that's when I knew it was an online predator. That's when I decided I need to go to the police. I reached out to all the victims, including Tommy, because I wanted to let them know everything that was going on and that they could trust me and respecting if they wanted to remain anonymous. When I went to the police station, I didn't get, brought into a room to be interviewed. It was pretty much a 5-minute conversation. They took my info and I hoped it would be taken seriously. And I left.
After I blocked Dustin Michael, I thought I had solved the problem. But then a person named Marie Anna started messaging all my Facebook friends. Did you see the naked pictures of Grant? He has such a tiny and things like that were just meant to humiliate me. Almost as if she was taunting me and taunting my friends, and I just felt hopeless. I felt like there was no end in sight.
In 2015, I was at a college in Minnesota working on my bachelor's degree in psychology. After 2012, the weeks went by and nothing ended up happening as far as I didn't hear any more of Courtney. I had assumed that Courtney was taken care of by authorities. Maria Ann had messaged me on Facebook asking if I wanted to see a picture of a guy that was currently a junior in high school at Rosemount. And then right after that, Maria Ann started listing off guys that were in my grade at Rosemount High School. And it was the same exact guys Courtney had sent me. I had the sense of deja vu. What are the chances that Maria Ann and Courtney had nude photos of the same exact people? There was no doubt in my mind that it was Courtney. I didn't want to assume that the authorities didn't do anything, but I knew that obviously this person wasn't arrested. They weren't in prison. I knew that I needed to take this to someone that would take this seriously. So that's when I realized I needed to email Rosemount High School.
In 2015, I was assigned as a school resource officer to provide security and safety for the school, and students and staff can just walk in my office to make a report.
I met Beth Rixmeyer at Rosemount High School. Right away, I felt Beth's gonna do something about this. I got the sense that she was empathetic and she seemed to want to take it very seriously.
I didn't seek out those students mentioned. I didn't have time. They just started coming to my office. It was a sense of relief that they found someone that might help them. All the students I met with, all of them were already 18 years old, but they had been dealing with this going on from about 13 years old, 14 years old. Quite honestly, my head was spinning. There was just so much activity that had gone on for a number of years, and they were trying to handle it themselves. The number of victims was increasing, so I knew very quickly I was going to need assistance from other law enforcement agencies.
Trying to connect all the dots to actually understand the story was an extremely arduous job to do. So what the Electronic Crimes Unit offered were specialized investigators that could look at that data and start to help put together that puzzle.
There were multiple accounts being used. There were fake accounts that had been generated to continue conversations with multiple people over a long period of time. What that suggests is that they were aware that it would be more difficult to track a single person through multiple names.
One of the tools I had was an undercover Facebook account in which I was friends with numerous current and former students of Rosemount. And one day I was contacted through that undercover account by the suspect offering me naked photos of 5 victims that I had already interviewed. There was almost a word-for-word template used throughout the messages. For this one, it was laugh out loud, want to see this guy's nudes for fun? It'd be funny to show a bunch of people and send it to everyone at school, laugh out loud. Will you send it to a bunch of people and tell them to spread it out? Ultimately, there was over 50 different decoy accounts, and they would shut down, activate, shut down, activate. So it was like a cat and mouse. But when I got the search warrants back on those social media accounts, I could see that the addresses kept coming back to the same residence, and this residence was in the city of Eagan.
The city of Eagan borders the city of Rosemount in Dakota County, Minnesota. We were able to pinpoint an address of a 32-year-old male.
The residence is just down the street. When we arrived on the day of the search warrant, we parked on the street and approached the house. There's approximately 20 of us in the team.
I can recall feeling very anxious. You could hear an individual moving inside the residence. And it became clear after 30 to 40, 50 seconds that they weren't coming to the door immediately. During that time, you feel vulnerable standing outside of a residence. You don't know what they're preparing. We then started to believe that perhaps the suspect was destroying evidence. We decided to breach the door with a ram. The suspect was on the lower level of the split entry home, and he appeared disheveled and surprised that we had entered the residence and visibly was nervous. Right away, one of the searchers found a laptop behind the washer and dryer that had been snapped in half, and it appeared that someone had dumped water onto that laptop. One of the searchers brought in a ladder and began searching the ceiling tiles in the lower level of the residence. And in those ceiling tiles, we found multiple items of digital media, cell phones, thumb drives, etc. Someone had specifically placed them in that location with the hopes that they'd never be found.
On a flash drive, they found hundreds of files.
There were over 300 folders that had names, date of births, schools, penis sizes, approximate height, approximate weight, and their build. In addition, there was approximately 3,000 images and videos of the victims.
My suspect was Anton Martinenko, a mortgage lender in the city of Eagan. Anton Martinenko was a member of a gym that many of the victims were also members at and was friends with some of the victims, but the victims clearly did not know that Anton Martinenko was behind the decoy accounts advertising and distributing their nude photos. Anton Martinenko was adamant that it was someone else. He denied any responsibility or acknowledgement of the items that we were finding. When we executed the search warrant, it was just to search the residence, his vehicle, and his workplace. It was not an arrest search warrant, and we were unable to take Anton Martinenko into custody. After we had executed the search warrant, the focus was on preparing for a court case. And we had to identify which victims would be comfortable in testifying in court. During our interviews of the victims at the FBI headquarters in Minnesota, a victim disclosed that Anton Martinenko had not ceased his activity. The activity was happening presently. There was a decoy account, very active, threatening to distribute photos to the victim's friends if they did not give more nude photos. As we were monitoring that activity, the pressure and aggressiveness was increasing.
Martinenko was demanding that if he did not get any of these nude images by the deadline of 4:30 that day, that he was going to send nude images of the victim out to classmates. It was a race against time. We needed to get in front of a judge to obtain an arrest warrant before Martinenko would send out these images. So by approximately 2:30, we were able to obtain a warrant for a search and arrest of Martinenko. By approximately 4:20, we were executing the search and arrest warrant at Martinenko's residence.
It took several attempts to gain entrance in the front door because the door from the first search warrant to the second search warrant had been reinforced with more deadbolts.
As they made entry, Mr. Martinenko was locked in the bathroom, and they had to breach the bathroom door.
Upon entry, we found Martinenko attempting to destroy the phone by flushing it into the toilet.
Anton Martinenko was located in the master bathroom, and inside the toilet was a cell phone. The toilet bowl had been used. He had had a bowel movement in the toilet.
Recovering the phone and extracting the evidence was crucial to the investigation.
That particular phone, it was challenging. So the first thing we were trying to do was dry it out and make sure that it was not damaged. It just didn't work. So we had to take it apart and acquire the data through a very slow process that took around 100 hours or more.
When the forensics team described how much information was in there, we had solid forensic evidence tying Anton Martinenko to these active decoy accounts.
Anton Martinenko and others who engage in sextortion often do it just to hold power over others. Power that they cannot achieve in their regular lives. And this is a good example of someone who became sort of obsessed with what he was doing, luring boys into his web and luring them into a trap. It's extremely important for victims, if they're comfortable doing it, to tell the judge what happened. Federal judges, in my experience, take that information very seriously.
Once I heard that there were hundreds of other victims, I felt like it was my duty to represent them, have the strength for them to stand in court and explain what happened to us. Anton Martinenko manipulated my hopes of legal modeling and turned them into child pornography, leaving me with anxiety, sleep loss due to constant fear of attack. He took my proud self-esteem and stomped on it with years of systematically humiliating me by posting and showing my Facebook friends child pornography. He took my innocent, loving brain and filled it with the unshakable desire to smash his computer over his skull to end my years of suffering for his brutal harassment. I never could have guessed how much relief I would feel from the FBI calling me. He won't be harassing me anymore. Lock him up and melt the key. The FBI explained in the court hearing that the pictures that I had sent to Courtney Janskin were actually sold on the dark web and could still be out there circulating. That's definitely disheartening and still gives me worries that it can crop up and affect my career someday.
Martinenko's sentence is very lengthy, and it is a measure of the impact that it had on his victims. He showed no mercy. He was the largest producer of child pornography at the time in Minnesota history.
Martinenko did physically meet up with some of the victims. He lured the victims with the premises that he would stop sending out their photographs. But Martinenko's intent was to get the victims in order to perform sex acts with the victims.
Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that a story would be written into its streets for the next 3 decades. The houses were modest, evenly spaced, their porch lights glowing softly against the humid Florida air. Crickets chirped in the grass. A television flickered behind half-closed blinds. It was the kind of quiet suburban block where people believed the worst thing that could happen was a broken mailbox or a late-night noise complaint. But at 2:17 a.m., a single phone call shattered that illusion. The dispatcher's voice came through calm and routine, but the words carried a weight that officers would remember for years. A woman had been found, unresponsive, inside her own home. Patrol cars rolled through the sleeping streets, red and blue lights silently washing over white fences and parked cars. Officers approached the small stucco house at the end of the block. The front door stood half open, swinging slightly in the warm breeze. Inside, the air was thick with stillness. And on the living room floor, beneath the dim glow of a standing lamp, lay the body of 27-year-old Melissa Carter. The first officer on scene later said something about the moment never left him. Not the sight itself, but the silence. The unsettling stillness of a place where, hours earlier, life had moved normally. Dinner dishes still rested in the sink. A half-finished glass of iced tea sat on the coffee table. Nothing overturned. Nothing smashed. No sign of forced entry. Yet Melissa Carter was dead. The medical examiner would later confirm what investigators feared almost immediately. This was not an accident, not a sudden illness, not a tragic fall. Melissa had been killed. Word spread through the neighborhood before the sun had even risen. Yellow police tape wrapped around the house as curious neighbors gathered behind it, whispering in low voices. Melissa Carter was not the kind of person anyone expected to see on the evening news. She worked at a local insurance office downtown. Friendly, reliable, the kind of coworker who remembered birthdays and brought cupcakes into the break room. Her life was ordinary in the most comforting sense of the word. She had moved into the small house less than a year earlier. A quiet place to start fresh after a recent breakup. Friends said she was optimistic, rebuilding her life piece by piece. She jogged most mornings. Called her parents every Sunday. Waved to neighbors when she pulled into the driveway after work. And now, somehow, she was at the center of a crime scene that detectives would later describe as deeply unsettling. Because nothing about it made sense. There were no signs of struggle in the house. No evidence that someone had forced their way in. Her purse was still on the kitchen counter. Jewelry untouched. If this was a robbery, nothing had been taken. If it was random violence, the scene was too calm. Which left detectives with a chilling possibility. Melissa Carter likely knew the person who entered her home that night. By mid-morning, the story had reached local television stations. Reporters stood outside the taped-off property, microphones in hand. Police are investigating what they are calling a suspicious death. Neighbors say the victim was well known in the community. Authorities have not yet identified a suspect. The words repeated over and over across Florida airwaves. But behind the cameras, inside the investigation room at the sheriff's department, detectives were already feeling the first hints of something far more complicated than a routine homicide. They started where every case begins. Timeline. Melissa had left work shortly after 5 in the afternoon the previous day. Co-workers confirmed she seemed normal, even cheerful. She mentioned stopping by a grocery store before heading home. Security footage from a nearby market showed her at 5:42 p.m., pushing a small cart down the aisle, picking up a few items. Bread. Pasta. A bottle of wine. Ordinary. She paid, smiled at the cashier, and walked out the sliding doors. That was the last confirmed sighting of Melissa Carter alive. At 7:15 p.m., a neighbor reported seeing her car pull into the driveway. Lights in the house turned on shortly afterward. Then nothing. No screaming. No calls for help. No gunshots reported. Just silence. The first real alarm came when Melissa failed to show up for work the next morning. Her boss called several times. No answer. Concerned, a coworker drove by the house on the way to the office. The front door was slightly open. That's when the 911 call was made. Detectives combed through the house inch by inch. Fingerprints. Fibers. Anything that could explain what had happened between the moment Melissa arrived home and the moment her life ended. But the evidence was strangely thin. Too thin. The house looked almost preserved. As if whoever had been there knew exactly what they were doing. Or had simply never needed to struggle at all. The medical examiner's report added another layer to the mystery. Melissa had died sometime between 9 p.m. and midnight. There were signs she had allowed someone inside voluntarily. No defensive wounds. No overturned furniture. Which meant the final hours of her life likely unfolded in a way that investigators could only reconstruct through fragments. 2 glasses had been found in the sink. 2. One still carried faint lipstick marks. The other did not. It suggested something simple, almost mundane. Melissa had shared a drink with someone. Someone who sat in her living room. Someone she trusted enough to invite into her home late at night. That discovery shifted the direction of the investigation immediately. Detectives began building a list. Friends, co-workers, former partners, anyone who might have visited the house that evening. They interviewed neighbors again, this time with sharper questions. Had anyone seen a car parked nearby? Heard voices? Noticed anything unusual? One neighbor mentioned seeing headlights outside the house around 9:30 p.m., but couldn't describe the vehicle. Another thought they heard a door close shortly before midnight. None of it was precise enough to identify a suspect. Still, the list of people connected to Melissa Carter slowly grew. Her co-workers described her as friendly but private. Her recent breakup had been amicable. No history of threats. No obvious enemies. Which made the case even more unsettling. Because statistically, most homicide victims know their killer. And somewhere in Melissa's life, detectives believed, was someone who had walked into that house on a quiet Florida night and walked out again, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt investigators for decades. Weeks passed. Interviews turned into re-interviews. Alibis were checked, double-checked, then checked again. But every lead seemed to dissolve the moment detectives tried to follow it further. The evidence locker filled with small pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a picture. Fingerprints that belonged to friends. Fibers that matched furniture inside the home. Nothing definitive. Nothing that pointed to a killer. Local media began using a phrase that would cling to the case like a shadow. A Florida cold case in the making. And for Melissa Carter's family, the waiting was unbearable. Her parents traveled to Florida repeatedly, sitting in quiet interview rooms with detectives who could offer sympathy but no answers. Each new lead raised hope. Each dead end crushed it again. Months became years. The house at the end of the block was eventually sold. New families moved in. Children rode bikes past the driveway where police cars once stood. Life continued in the neighborhood. But inside the sheriff's department, Melissa Carter's file never disappeared. It grew thicker. Photographs. Interview transcripts. Evidence reports. Detectives came and went over the years, each one studying the same haunting question. Who had been in that house that night? And why had they walked away unnoticed? Because somewhere out there, investigators believed, was a person who carried the answer. Someone who had quietly blended back into everyday life. Someone who had watched the news coverage fade. Someone who knew exactly what happened in that living room in 1995. 4 years, that person remained invisible. Until decades later when a new piece of evidence surfaced. A discovery that would shock investigators. And lead them straight to a quiet suburban street. A place where a man had been living peacefully for years. A place where no one suspected that the shadow of a 1995 Florida cold case had been sitting quietly behind a perfectly trimmed lawn waiting to be uncovered. 4 years, the file sat in a gray metal cabinet inside the sheriff's department, thick, heavy, and unfinished. Detectives rotated through the unit as time passed, each one inheriting the same box of photographs, transcripts, and unanswered questions. Melissa Carter's name remained typed across the top in fading black ink, a reminder of a night in 1995 when something terrible had slipped silently through a quiet Florida neighborhood and vanished before anyone realized what had happened. Cold cases have a strange gravity to them. They never truly disappear. They linger in the back of investigators' minds, surfacing during quiet moments, late nights in empty offices, slow shifts when the phones stop ringing. Melissa's case was one of those. The scene photos alone were enough to make detectives uneasy even decades later. A tidy living room. A lamp casting soft light across beige carpet. 2 drinking glasses placed carefully in the sink. And a body on the floor. The image suggested something calm had turned violent in the span of a few minutes. No warning. No chaos. Just a moment when trust was broken and someone decided to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. During the first year of the investigation, detectives had pursued every lead they could find. Friends, neighbors, co-workers, anyone connected to Melissa Carter's life was questioned, sometimes more than once. They spoke to her ex-boyfriend, Daniel Reeves. Reeves had been the obvious starting point. The breakup had happened only 3 months earlier. But by every account, it had ended peacefully. Daniel had already started seeing someone new. Phone records placed him at a restaurant across town the night Melissa died. Witnesses confirmed it. Still, detectives pressed. Had he visited her that night? Had she called him? Had there been an argument no one knew about? Reeves denied it all. And nothing investigators uncovered contradicted his story. Next came co-workers. Melissa worked in a quiet insurance office where routine defined the day. Filing claims, answering calls, processing paperwork. Her colleagues described her as dependable, friendly, but not deeply involved in anyone's personal drama. No workplace conflicts. No stalkers. No strange encounters. Even her neighbors struggled to offer anything suspicious. The street had always been peaceful. Retired couples, young families, the occasional college student renting a spare room. One elderly neighbor remembered seeing Melissa watering plants in the evenings. Another said she sometimes waved while jogging past early in the morning. But no one reported seeing anyone unusual near her home that night. As weeks turned into months, detectives began to notice something unsettling. Every path they followed eventually circled back to the same empty center. Whoever had been in that house knew how to disappear. The forensic evidence offered only faint whispers of possibility. The 2 glasses in the sink suggested a guest. But fingerprints recovered from them matched several people already known to Melissa, friends who had visited the house previously. None tied directly to the night of the murder. Hair samples collected from the carpet turned out to belong to Melissa herself. Fibers matched her couch. Nothing foreign. Nothing conclusive. In the mid-1990s, forensic technology simply wasn't what it would become years later. DNA analysis existed, but it was limited, expensive, and often required larger samples than investigators had recovered. Detectives preserved everything they could, carefully sealing items in evidence bags. Back then, they hoped the answers might appear through interviews or witness testimony. But time moved forward. The investigation slowed. Then stalled. By the end of 1997, the Carter case had entered a category every detective dreads: unsolved. The local newspapers began referring to it as one of Florida's lingering mysteries. Melissa's parents refused to let the story fade completely. Every anniversary of her death, they called reporters, hoping renewed attention might spark a tip. Sometimes it worked. Tips came in, dozens of them over the years. A suspicious coworker. A jealous acquaintance. A man spotted driving slowly through the neighborhood weeks earlier. Detectives chased them all. And one by one, each lead collapsed under scrutiny. The case became something heavier than a simple unsolved homicide. It became a ghost story within the department. New detectives assigned to cold cases would eventually hear about it during late-night conversations. The Carter file, someone would say. The story always sounded the same. No forced entry. 2 glasses in the sink. No witnesses. No suspect. Just silence. By the early 2000s, nearly a decade had passed since the night Melissa Carter died. The neighborhood had changed. New paint on the houses. Different families living behind the same doors. The house where the crime occurred had been renovated twice. The living room carpet replaced. Walls repainted. Furniture rearranged. Anyone driving past would never guess that a homicide once occurred inside. Yet inside the sheriff's department, the evidence box remained untouched but never forgotten. Then something happened that investigators had quietly hoped for but never fully expected. Technology changed. Across the country, cold cases that had gathered dust for decades were suddenly reopening. Advances in DNA testing began solving crimes investigators once believed impossible to crack. Tiny fragments of biological material, samples too small to analyze in the 1990s, could now reveal identities with startling precision. Police departments began re-examining old evidence. And the Carter case returned to the table. In 2018, a cold case unit within the department reviewed dozens of unsolved homicides from the 1990s. Melissa's file immediately caught attention. The circumstances were too strange, too controlled, too personal. Detectives reopened the evidence box carefully. Photographs were scanned into digital archives. Interview tapes were converted from aging cassette recordings. And every physical piece of evidence was re-examined under modern forensic standards. Among the items preserved from the original investigation was something that earlier detectives had noted but never fully explored. A partial DNA sample recovered from the rim of the second drinking glass. In 1995, the sample had been considered too weak for reliable identification. But modern laboratories had tools capable of amplifying genetic traces far smaller than investigators once believed usable. The sample was sent for reanalysis. Weeks passed while forensic scientists worked quietly in a lab hundreds of miles away. For detectives in Florida, the wait felt strangely familiar. Another hope. Another possibility. They had learned not to expect miracles. Then one afternoon, the phone rang. The lab had results. The DNA sample had produced a usable profile. Not perfect, but strong enough to search national databases. Detectives immediately submitted the profile to CODIS, the combined DNA index system used by law enforcement across the United States. Sometimes those searches produced immediate hits. Other times they returned nothing. In this case, the result came back within hours. No direct match. But that wasn't the end of the story. Because forensic science had evolved again. Investigators were now exploring a controversial but powerful technique, genetic genealogy. Instead of searching only criminal databases, scientists could compare unknown DNA profiles against public genealogy websites used by millions of people researching their family history. Even if the suspect himself had never submitted DNA, a distant relative might have. And that could be enough. The Carter case suddenly moved from a quiet file in a cabinet to an active investigation again. Genealogists began constructing family trees based on partial matches from public DNA databases. Second cousins. Third cousins. Distant relatives scattered across the country. Slowly, carefully, a web of connections formed. And at the center of that web, one name began appearing more than once. A man who had lived in Florida in the mid-1990s. A man who, according to records, had lived less than 5 miles from Melissa Carter's home. A man who had never been interviewed during the original investigation. 30 years had passed since the night Melissa Carter died. But the trail investigators were now following led directly toward a quiet suburban neighborhood. A place filled with tidy lawns and parked minivans. A place where neighbors described one particular resident in simple, familiar terms. Friendly. Quiet. Kept to himself. The kind of man no one would ever associate with a brutal crime from decades earlier. Yet detectives studying the evidence were beginning to suspect something chilling. Because the DNA profile from Melissa Carter's kitchen glass did not belong to a stranger passing through town. It belonged to someone who had been living peacefully for years hiding in plain sight. And soon, investigators would knock on his door. The house sat halfway down a quiet street lined with trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes. Morning sunlight spilled across the asphalt as sprinklers clicked rhythmically across green lawns. It looked like every other suburban block in central Florida, orderly, calm, almost boring in its predictability. The man detectives were watching stepped out of his front door just after 7:10 a.m. He carried a travel mug in one hand and a folded newspaper under his arm. His movements were unhurried, routine. He locked the door behind him, walked down the driveway, and climbed into a silver sedan parked neatly along the curb. Neighbors would later say the same thing about him. Polite. Quiet. Normal. The kind of person who nodded hello but never lingered long enough for conversation. For nearly 3 decades, That was how people knew him. A quiet man living an ordinary suburban life. But parked down the street, inside an unmarked vehicle with tinted windows, two detectives watched him carefully. Because the name connected to the DNA profile from Melissa Carter's kitchen glass belonged to that man. His name was Thomas Grady. And until the moment the genealogy report arrived, investigators had never heard it before. Grady had lived in Florida in 1995. Records placed him working maintenance at a regional shipping warehouse roughly 15 minutes from Melissa Carter's home. At the time of the murder, he was 29 years old. Young enough to blend easily into a crowd. Old enough to live independently without attracting attention. More importantly, something else had caught the detectives' attention when they first examined his history. His address in 1995. It placed him in an apartment complex only 3 miles from Melissa's house. That alone might have meant nothing. Florida cities were dense with overlapping neighborhoods and shared roads. But the deeper investigators looked, the more the coincidences began to feel less like coincidence. Thomas Grady's name had appeared once before in connection with Melissa Carter. Not as a suspect. Not as a witness. But buried quietly inside an old document from the original investigation. A grocery store receipt. When detectives in 1995 traced Melissa's final known movements, they obtained a copy of the receipt from the supermarket where she had stopped after work. The timestamp was clear, 5:42 p.m. Bread. Pasta. A bottle of wine. Ordinary purchases. But the receipt also included the cashier's identification number. At the time, detectives interviewed the cashier briefly, asking if she remembered anything unusual about Melissa that evening. The cashier had said no. What investigators never realized back then was that the store's evening maintenance worker, scheduled to clean the aisles and restock shelves during closing hours, was a man named Thomas Grady. The connection had been invisible for decades. Until the DNA report changed everything. Now detectives sat in their car watching him drive away from his house, merging into light morning traffic as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. Because the cold case that haunted the department for nearly 30 years suddenly had a living, breathing suspect. Still, DNA from a drinking glass alone was not enough to close the case. Detectives needed confirmation. They needed to place Grady inside Melissa Carter's home that night. And more importantly, they needed his DNA directly. The investigation shifted quietly into surveillance. No dramatic arrests. No flashing lights. Not yet. For several weeks, detectives studied Grady's life from a distance. He worked as a facilities supervisor for a small office complex outside the city. A steady job. No criminal record beyond a minor traffic citation 15 years earlier. Every morning he left his house at nearly the same time. Every evening he returned just before sunset. Weekends were predictable too. Grocery store trips. Hardware store visits. Occasional dinners at a neighborhood diner. Neighbors described him as reliable. A man who kept his lawn trimmed and his mailbox freshly painted. One couple across the street told detectives he sometimes helped them carry heavy boxes inside. "He's a good guy," the husband said. Quiet, but good. For investigators listening to those words, the contrast was unsettling. Because sitting inside an evidence bag at the sheriff's department was a DNA profile suggesting something very different. The question was no longer whether Thomas Grady had been in Melissa Carter's house. The DNA said he had. The real question was why. During surveillance, detectives began quietly rebuilding Grady's life history. Public records revealed something interesting. In 1995, the same year Melissa Carter was murdered, Grady moved out of his apartment just 3 weeks after the crime. No explanation listed. He relocated to another county nearly 60 miles away. New job. New address. Then, over the next 2 decades, he slowly built the life investigators were now watching from their unmarked car. Marriage. Divorce. A small house purchased in a quiet subdivision. No arrests. No violence reported. Nothing in his history suggested a man capable of murder. But cold cases often carry a disturbing truth. Sometimes the person responsible simply moves on. They build new routines, new friendships, new identities built on silence. And the past stays buried until something unexpected digs it up again. Detectives knew they needed one more step before approaching him. Direct DNA. Legally obtained. So they waited. One evening, just after sunset, Grady stopped at a gas station on his way home. Detectives watched as he stepped out of his car, walked inside the convenience store, and purchased a bottle of soda. He drank part of it as he walked back toward the car. Then, casually, he tossed the empty bottle into a trash bin near the pump. For the average person, it was a meaningless gesture. For investigators, it was the moment they had been waiting for. Minutes later, after Grady drove away, a detective walked calmly to the trash bin and retrieved the bottle. Inside the vehicle, they sealed it carefully inside an evidence bag. If the DNA from that bottle matched the sample from Melissa Carter's glass, the case would change forever. The bottle was sent to the lab the following morning. The wait for results felt strangely similar to the tension detectives imagined must have existed inside Melissa Carter's house that night in 1995, quiet, uncertain, filled with questions. Days passed. Then the call came. The DNA profile from the bottle matched the unknown profile recovered from the drinking glass in Melissa's sink. The probability of it belonging to anyone else was astronomically small. After 28 years of silence, the cold case had finally spoken. Thomas Grady had been in Melissa Carter's home the night she died. Detectives now faced the moment every investigator both anticipates and dreads. The confrontation. Because somewhere inside the quiet suburban man's memory was the truth about what happened in that living room. And soon, they would sit across from him in a small interrogation room and ask the question that had haunted this case for nearly 3 decades. Why? But as investigators prepared for that interview, another discovery surfaced inside the old case files. A detail so strange it had been overlooked in 1995. A neighbor's statement. Just 3 lines buried deep in an interview transcript. The neighbor had reported seeing a man standing near Melissa Carter's front porch earlier that evening, hours before her death. The witness never saw his face clearly. But he remembered one thing with certainty. The man had been holding a grocery store bag. And in 1995, Thomas Grady worked nights inside the very grocery store where Melissa Carter made her final purchase. The quiet suburban man detectives were about to question might not have been a random visitor at all. He might have been watching her long before she ever opened her front door. The interrogation room was small, quiet, and deliberately plain. A metal table sat in the center beneath a fluorescent light that hummed faintly overhead. 2 chairs faced each other across the scratched surface. A camera in the corner blinked silently, recording every movement. Thomas Grady sat with his hands folded loosely in front of him. He had agreed to come voluntarily. When detectives knocked on his door earlier that morning, he had looked surprised but not panicked. Calm, even polite. The kind of reaction investigators had learned to read carefully. Because sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who didn't look dangerous at all. Grady wore a plain blue shirt and jeans. His hair had thinned with age, and faint lines crossed his face in ways that suggested a life of quiet routine rather than chaos. But detectives sitting across from him were not interested in the man he had become. They were interested in the man he had been in 1995. The recorder clicked on. One of the detectives leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Grady," he began calmly, "we're reopening an old investigation. A case from 1995. Grady nodded slowly. His eyes moved between the 2 detectives, careful, controlled. "Okay," he said. "Do you remember a woman named Melissa Carter?" For a moment, there was nothing. No expression. No movement. Then Grady's brow tightened slightly, as if searching through distant memories. "I might," he said slowly. "That was a long time ago." Detectives expected that answer. It had been nearly 3 decades since Melissa Carter died. But the evidence they now held told a different story, one that placed Grady directly inside her home on the night of the murder. Still, They began carefully, methodically. Back in 1995, the detective continued, you worked nights at the Gulfside Market on Riverside Avenue. Is that correct? Grady nodded again. Yeah. Maintenance. Cleaning floors. Stocking sometimes. And you remember customers who came through the store? Some of them, I guess. The detective slid a photograph across the table. It was one of the original images from Melissa Carter's driver's license. Young, smiling, taken years before the crime scene photos investigators had studied so many times. Grady looked down at it. His face remained neutral. Does she look familiar? Another pause. Then a shrug. Maybe, he said. That answer was not unusual. Detectives had heard it countless times from suspects attempting to keep distance from uncomfortable truths. So they moved forward. We believe you may have encountered her at the store. That's possible. Did you ever visit her home? Grady looked up sharply at that. Just a flicker of surprise, but detectives saw it. The moment lasted less than a second. Then it disappeared. No, he said. The word came quickly. Too quickly. Inside the observation room behind the one-way glass, another detective leaned forward. The tension inside the investigation had suddenly shifted. Because the evidence in the lab already proved that statement was a lie. The detective at the table remained calm. Mr. Grady, he said quietly, we've recovered DNA from inside Melissa Carter's home. DNA that places you there the night she died. Silence fell across the room. Grady didn't move. Didn't speak. His eyes lowered toward the metal table again. And for nearly 10 full seconds, the room held its breath. When he finally looked up again, his expression had changed. Not fear. Something else. Calculation. That doesn't make sense, he said slowly. Detectives expected denial. It was the most common reaction when confronted with forensic evidence. But the tone of his voice carried something different, something investigators recognized immediately. He wasn't shocked. He was thinking. Which meant somewhere inside his memory, the truth was already moving. The detective slid another photograph across the table. This one showed the 2 glasses recovered from Melissa's sink in 1995. Melissa Carter had a guest in her home the night she died, the detective said. 2 glasses. 2 people. Grady stared at the photo longer this time. You want to explain how your DNA ended up there? Grady leaned back slightly in his chair. The fluorescent light cast sharp shadows across his face. Then he exhaled slowly. I might have been there, he said. Inside the observation room, one detective whispered under his breath. There it was. The first crack. The man who had denied knowing Melissa Carter minutes earlier was now admitting he had been inside her house the night she died. But the story that followed would only deepen the mystery. I didn't kill anyone, Grady continued. I just stopped by. The detectives remained silent, letting him talk. That night she came into the store. I remember her. She dropped a bag in the parking lot. Groceries fell everywhere. He paused. I helped her pick them up. The story sounded ordinary. Too ordinary. Grady continued. She thanked me. Said I could stop by later if I wanted the bottle of wine she bought. As a thank you. The detective raised an eyebrow. That's how you ended up in her house? Grady nodded slowly. I went over around 9. What happened inside? We talked. Had a drink. Nothing weird. Then what? Grady's eyes dropped again. I left. That's it. Yeah. The room fell silent again. Detectives had heard thousands of suspect statements over the years. And they knew exactly when a story didn't fit the evidence. Because if Thomas Grady had simply left Melissa Carter alive that night, someone else would have needed to enter the house afterward. Without forcing the door. Without leaving forensic evidence. Without being seen by neighbors. A second visitor. A second killer. The possibility existed. But investigators knew how unlikely it was. The detective leaned forward again. Mr. Grady Melissa Carter died between 9 and midnight that night. Grady didn't respond. You just told us you were there around 9. Still silence. The detective placed one final photograph on the table. The crime scene photo. The living room floor. Melissa Carter lying beneath the lamp. Grady's eyes landed on it. And for the first time since entering the room, something real appeared on his face. Not panic. Not anger. But recognition. The detective spoke quietly. She trusted whoever was in that house. Another pause. You were the last person with her. Grady rubbed his hands together slowly. The calm suburban man who had lived unnoticed for nearly 30 years now sat at the center of a case that had haunted investigators for decades. But when he finally spoke again, the words that came out were not a confession. They were something far more unsettling. You don't understand, he said quietly. The detective tilted his head slightly. Then help us understand. Grady stared at the photograph of Melissa Carter for a long moment. Then he said something that instantly shifted the direction of the entire investigation. There was someone else there. The detectives didn't move. Another person? Grady nodded slowly. Yes. The statement hung in the air like a shockwave. Because if what he was saying was true, the case investigators believed they had finally solved might actually be hiding something far more disturbing. A second presence inside Melissa Carter's house. A person no one had ever identified. And if that person truly existed, then the quiet suburban man sitting in the interrogation room might not be the only secret the 1995 cold case had been hiding all these years. The room seemed to shrink after Thomas Grady said the words. There was someone else there. Detectives had heard many versions of denial over the years, misdirection, half-truths, elaborate fabrications, but this one arrived differently. It wasn't shouted in panic or wrapped in confusion. It came out calmly, almost quietly, as if he had been waiting for the moment to say it. Across the metal table, the detectives exchanged a brief glance. Because if that statement was true, the implications were enormous. And if it wasn't, it was the opening move in a lie that had been waiting nearly 30 years to unfold. The lead detective leaned forward slightly. Another person, he repeated. Grady nodded. Yes. Who? Grady hesitated, rubbing the side of his thumb against the edge of the table. I didn't know him. The answer landed heavily. Unknown visitors inside homicide scenes were rare but not impossible. Still, the investigators knew the house had shown no evidence of forced entry. Melissa Carter had let someone in. Someone she trusted. Now the man sitting across from them was claiming there had been 2 visitors that night. Walk us through it, the detective said. Grady inhaled slowly, as if replaying the memory piece by piece. I got there around 9. She opened the door. We talked for a while. Had a drink. That matches the evidence, the detective said quietly. Grady continued. After maybe 20 minutes someone knocked. The detectives said nothing. Melissa seemed surprised. She didn't expect anyone. Did she say who it was? Grady shook his head. She just went to the door. What did you do? I stayed in the living room. Grady's eyes drifted briefly toward the wall camera before returning to the detectives. I heard voices. Male voice. Yes. Did you recognize it? No. How long were they talking? A minute maybe. Then they both came inside. The story had begun to take shape, but something about it felt incomplete. The detective pressed further. Describe him. Grady leaned back, thinking. Tall, maybe 6 feet. Dark jacket. Baseball cap. Face. Didn't see it clearly. The detective's pen moved across his notebook. What happened next? Grady looked down again. They started arguing. The room went quiet. Arguing about what? I don't know exactly, something about money maybe. Did Melissa seem scared? Grady hesitated again. More angry. That detail caught the detective's attention. Because according to the original crime scene, there had been no signs of a violent struggle in the house. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. Nothing suggesting a heated confrontation had taken place. Still, they allowed the story to continue. "What did you do while they argued?" the detective asked. "I told them I should probably leave." "Did you?" Grady nodded. "Yes." "Did you see what happened after you left?" "No." "Did you hear anything outside the house?" "No." The detective tapped his pen against the notebook slowly. Because the timeline Grady was describing created a new possibility. One that had never appeared in the original investigation. If a second man had entered the house around 9:30 and if Grady had left shortly afterward, then theoretically someone else could have been present when Melissa Carter died. But there was a problem with that version of events. A big one. The detective opened a folder and slid a printed document across the table. "Mr. Grady," he said calmly, "neighbors were interviewed extensively in 1995. Grady looked at the paper but didn't touch it. One neighbor reported hearing a door close shortly before midnight. He paused. "That's nearly 3 hours after you say you left." The silence returned. Grady's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't know anything about that." Another neighbor reported seeing headlights outside the house around 10 p.m. Still nothing from Grady. The detective leaned forward. "Are you sure you left when you say you did?" "Yes." The answer came quickly again. Too quickly. Inside the observation room, investigators were already noticing the pattern. Grady's story contained just enough detail to sound plausible, but not enough to verify. The second man he described had no name. No clear face. No identifiable features. Just a shadow wearing a cap. A perfect ghost. The detective at the table closed the folder slowly. "Let's go back to the beginning," he said. "When you first helped Melissa Carter in the grocery store parking lot, how did you know where she lived?" Grady blinked once. "She told me." "When?" "When I helped her pick up the groceries." The detective tilted his head slightly. "That's interesting." Grady didn't respond. Because in 1995, investigators checked the store's security cameras. That was partially true. The cameras had been poor quality, but detectives had reviewed what little footage existed. "There's no sign of you helping her outside." Grady's expression remained still. "So maybe you met her somewhere else," the detective continued. "No. Maybe you followed her home?" Grady shook his head firmly. "No." "Then help me understand something." The detective leaned forward, his voice lowering slightly. "How did a maintenance worker at a grocery store end up drinking wine inside a stranger's home the same night she was murdered?" Grady didn't answer. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint buzz of the fluorescent light overhead. The calm suburban man who had lived unnoticed for decades now sat surrounded by a growing web of contradictions. Detectives could feel it tightening. And somewhere inside that web was the truth. The detective finally broke the silence. "You know what makes this case strange, Mr. Grady?" Grady looked up. Everything about that house suggested Melissa trusted the person she let inside. Another pause. No forced entry. No signs of panic. 2 glasses ready for a drink. He tapped the photo of the glasses in the sink. That wasn't a surprise visitor. That was someone she expected. Grady's fingers tightened slightly against the table. And then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in his expression. Because the story he had been building for the last 30 minutes about the unknown man, the sudden argument, the early departure was beginning to crack under the weight of simple logic. If Melissa had expected someone that night, who had she been expecting? The detectives already had the DNA answer for one visitor. Thomas Grady. But if he was telling the truth about another person entering the house, then somewhere in the past, buried inside the original investigation, there might be a clue no one had noticed. Something small. Something overlooked. Something that had been sitting quietly in the evidence box for nearly 30 years. And as investigators reviewing the old files would soon realize, there was exactly one piece of evidence from 1995 that had never been fully explained. A second wine glass. The one without lipstick. The one carrying Thomas Grady's DNA. But on its base, barely visible in the original photographs, was something else. A partial fingerprint. A fingerprint that did not belong to Melissa Carter. And did not belong to Thomas Grady. Which meant one thing. If the evidence was correct, then the quiet suburban man sitting in that interrogation room might not be lying about everything. Because the 1995 Florida cold case might truly have had another visitor inside that house. A person investigators had never identified. A person whose fingerprint had been sitting unnoticed on a wine glass for nearly 3 decades. And now that investigators knew to look for it, the question suddenly became far more disturbing. Who had been standing in that living room the night Melissa Carter died? And where had that person gone? The fingerprint had been there the entire time. For nearly 3 decades, it sat quietly inside a sealed evidence bag, catalogued, photographed, and then forgotten beneath layers of paperwork and outdated forensic reports. Detectives in 1995 had noticed it, of course, but at the time, it didn't stand out as unusual. Partial prints were common in houses where people lived normal lives, entertaining friends and welcoming visitors. Without a suspect to compare it to, the mark on the base of the wine glass had simply become another unanswered detail. Now everything had changed. Because sitting inside an interrogation room was a man whose DNA had already placed him in Melissa Carter's house that night. And if his story about a second visitor was even partially true, that old fingerprint might finally mean something. Inside the sheriff's department, the cold case unit moved quickly. The original fingerprint photographs were pulled from the archives and digitized using modern scanning equipment. What had once looked like a smudged pattern of loops and ridges slowly sharpened into a clearer image. Not perfect, but usable. Technicians began running the print through national fingerprint databases, systems far more advanced than anything investigators had access to in 1995. Across the hall, detectives continued questioning Thomas Grady. The man who had lived quietly for decades now sat in the same chair, repeating the same explanation over and over. There was another guy. Every time they asked for details, the description remained almost identical. Tall. Dark jacket. Baseball cap. A voice he didn't recognize. A face he couldn't clearly see. Detectives had heard similar stories countless times before. The mysterious stranger. The unidentified third party. The phantom suspect who conveniently appears only when someone needs someone else to blame. Still, one detail about Grady's behavior kept bothering them. He wasn't panicking. Most suspects confronted with DNA evidence eventually reached a breaking point: anger, fear, desperation. But Grady's composure remained unusually steady. Almost like someone who believed part of his story might actually be provable. That thought lingered in the back of the lead detective's mind. Because if the fingerprint truly belonged to someone else, then the Carter case might be far more complicated than anyone expected. Late that afternoon, the fingerprint search returned its first results. No direct match. The print did not belong to anyone currently in the National Criminal Database. That result wasn't entirely surprising. Millions of people had never been fingerprinted for law enforcement records. But the technicians continued analyzing. They enhanced ridge patterns, mapped points of comparison, and uploaded the partial print into additional state databases, systems that sometimes held employment records, licensing files, or old arrest prints that never made it into federal systems. Hours passed. The investigation team waited in tense silence. Then, just after 7:40 p.m., a technician stepped into the cold case office holding a printed report. "Possible match," she said. The room froze. Detectives gathered around the desk as the report was placed under the light. The name at the top was unfamiliar to everyone in the room. Michael Tanner. The file indicated that Tanner had been fingerprinted in 1993 following a misdemeanor arrest, disorderly conduct outside a nightclub 2 counties away. No violent crimes. No prison time. Just a minor charge that had long since faded from public attention. But the fingerprint comparison showed something investigators couldn't ignore. 16 matching ridge points between Tanner's print and the partial print from the base of Melissa Carter's wine glass. Enough to consider it a probable identification. Suddenly, Thomas Grady's story didn't sound entirely impossible anymore. Because there had indeed been another person connected to that glass. A man named Michael Tanner. Detectives immediately began digging through Tanner's background. He was 32 in 1995, just a few years older than Grady. Records showed he had lived in Florida for most of his life, working various short-term jobs, construction, delivery driving, warehouse labor. Nothing about his history suggested a connection to Melissa Carter. No shared workplace. No known mutual friends. No address near her neighborhood. But one line inside the old records caught the investigators' attention. In 1995, Michael Tanner had been employed as a part-time delivery driver for a regional grocery distribution service. The same service that supplied the Gulfside market where Thomas Grady worked. The connection was small. But it was real. The two men might have known each other. Maybe only casually. Maybe more than that. Detectives returned to the interrogation room with the new information. Thomas Grady looked up when they entered. He could tell something had changed. The lead detective sat down slowly. "Mr. Grady," he said. "We found the fingerprint." Grady's expression remained steady, but his eyes sharpened slightly. "You remember the second wine glass?" Grady nodded once. "We identified the print on it." Another pause. The detective placed the new file on the table. Michael Tanner. For the first time since the interrogation began, Thomas Grady's composure cracked. Not dramatically. Just a brief tightening of his jaw. But it was enough. "You know him," the detective said quietly. Grady exhaled slowly. "Yeah." The room fell silent. "You told us earlier you didn't know the man," the detective continued. Grady stared at the table. "Not really. That's not what the evidence suggests." Grady rubbed his hands together again. "He worked deliveries at the store sometimes. So you did know him?" "Barely." The detective leaned forward. "Did you bring him to Melissa Carter's house that night?" "No." "Did he follow you there?" "I don't know." The answers were growing thinner. More fragile. Because now investigators had something they didn't have an hour earlier. A second real person connected to the crime scene. And if Michael Tanner had been inside that house the night Melissa Carter died, then somewhere out there was a man who might know the rest of the story. Detectives quickly began searching for him. But what they discovered next would turn the investigation in an even darker direction. Michael Tanner was not living quietly in another town. He wasn't working a normal job. And he wasn't hiding from the police. Because according to official records, Michael Tanner had been dead for 22 years. Killed in a highway crash in 2004. The only other person whose fingerprint appeared on the wine glass inside Melissa Carter's kitchen was a man who had taken whatever he knew about that night straight to the grave. Which meant the only living witness to what truly happened inside that house in 1995 was the quiet suburban man sitting across the interrogation table. Thomas Grady. And suddenly his story about another person wasn't just suspicious anymore. It was the last remaining thread connecting investigators to the truth. Because if Michael Tanner really had been in that living room that night, the question investigators now faced was terrifyingly simple. Who actually killed Melissa Carter? And why had both men kept silent about it for nearly 3 decades? The name Michael Tanner lingered in the interrogation room like a shadow that refused to leave. For detectives, the discovery created a strange and unsettling balance. On one hand, Thomas Grady's story about a second person inside Melissa Carter's home was no longer impossible. The fingerprint confirmed it. Tanner had been there. But on the other hand, the only man who could verify what happened next had been dead for more than 2 decades. That meant the entire truth now rested in the memory of the quiet suburban man sitting across the metal table. Thomas Grady. The detective folded his hands slowly. Michael Tanner died in 2004, he said. Grady's eyes moved slightly. "I heard about that," he replied. "You heard about it?" Yeah. How? Grady shrugged faintly. People talk. The detective studied him carefully. There was something almost practiced about the way Grady answered questions. Calm. Measured. Just enough information to sound cooperative without revealing anything useful. But detectives had already seen enough cracks in the story to know it wasn't solid. You told us you barely knew him, the detective said. I didn't. Yet you heard about his death years later. Grady didn't answer immediately. We worked at the same store sometimes, he finally said. Word got around. Another silence filled the room. The detective slid a new photograph across the table. This one wasn't from the crime scene. It was an old driver's license photo pulled from Michael Tanner's records. The man in the image had a square jaw, thick dark hair, and a faint scar across his chin. Take a look, the detective said. Grady glanced down at the photo. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face again, recognition mixed with something else. Memory. You remember him, the detective said quietly. Grady nodded slowly. Yeah. Was he the man who knocked on the door that night? Another pause. Then Grady nodded again. Yes. The room went quiet. Because that single confirmation rewrote the timeline investigators had believed for nearly 30 years. Melissa Carter had invited Thomas Grady into her home. Then Michael Tanner had arrived. 3 people inside the house. And sometime between 9 and midnight one of them ended up dead. The detective leaned forward slightly. What were you and Tanner arguing about? Grady frowned. I told you. Money or something. That's vague. I didn't hear everything. But you stayed in the room. Yes. So you must have heard something. Grady looked down again. They knew each other. The words were quiet but heavy. The detective's eyes narrowed. Melissa Carter knew Michael Tanner? I think so. You think so? They acted like they'd met before. That possibility had never appeared anywhere in the original investigation. Detectives in 1995 had searched Melissa's life thoroughly, friends, co-workers, neighbors. Michael Tanner's name had never surfaced. Which meant one of 2 things had to be true. Either Grady was inventing details to shift blame, or Melissa Carter had been hiding a connection to Tanner that no one had ever discovered. The detective pressed further. What kind of argument was it? Grady rubbed his temple slowly. Something about money she owed him. Did she owe him? I don't know. What happened after that? Grady hesitated again. They got louder. Did Tanner threaten her? I didn't hear a threat. Did he touch her? I don't remember. The detective studied him carefully. Because people often revealed the truth not through what they said, but through what they avoided saying. Did you touch her? Grady looked up sharply. No. You never touched Melissa Carter that night? No. The detective slid another photo onto the table. This one showed the living room carpet from the original crime scene. Her body was found right here. Grady glanced at the image quickly and looked away. Medical examiners determined she died from manual strangulation. He let the words hang in the air. That means someone used their hands. Grady's fingers tightened against the table. It wasn't me. Then it was Tanner. Grady didn't answer. The silence stretched longer this time. Inside the observation room, detectives were leaning forward again. Every small hesitation mattered now. Every shift in posture, every pause in speech. Because somewhere in this conversation was the moment when the truth would finally surface. The detective spoke again. When you left the house, was Melissa Carter alive? Yes. Was Michael Tanner still inside? Yes. So you're saying Tanner killed her? Grady shook his head quickly. I didn't say that. But that's what your story suggests. I don't know what happened after I left. The detective leaned back in his chair. The strategy was changing now. Because Grady had just unknowingly created a dangerous contradiction. Earlier, he said the argument had escalated. Now he was claiming he simply walked away from a heated confrontation between 2 people inside a private home. Let's talk about something else, the detective said calmly. Grady looked up again. After Melissa Carter died, you moved away. Grady nodded slowly. 3 weeks later, the detective added. So, that's a quick move. I got a better job. The detective opened a folder and pulled out a document. Records show you left your apartment in the middle of the month. Grady didn't react. No notice to your landlord. People move. Yes, they do. The detective closed the folder gently. But most people don't move 3 weeks after being the last known person inside a murder victim's home. The room went silent again. Grady's calm expression had begun to erode slightly. Tiny cracks appearing around the edges. Not panic, but pressure. The detective leaned forward again, his voice quieter now. You know something else that's strange? Grady didn't respond. We reviewed Michael Tanner's history. A pause. He had a habit of getting into fights. Grady's eyes shifted slightly. Bars. Parking lots. Small disputes that turned physical. Another pause. But there's no record of him ever strangling anyone. The detective let that thought sit for a moment. Then he added one final detail. Strangulation is personal. Grady said nothing. It takes time, the detective continued. Several minutes. You have to stay there. Keep your hands on someone while they fight to breathe. The fluorescent light hummed softly above them. That kind of violence usually happens between people who know each other very well. Another long silence. Thomas Grady stared down at the photograph of the living room carpet. And for a moment, something inside his eyes changed again. Because the calm suburban man investigators had been questioning for hours suddenly looked like someone remembering something he wished he could forget. Then he said something so quiet the detective almost missed it. She pushed him. The detective leaned forward. What? Grady swallowed slowly. Melissa, she pushed Tanner. The story was shifting again. And then, the detective asked. Grady's voice dropped even lower. And then everything got out of control. The words hung in the air. Because for the first time since the interrogation began, Thomas Grady had stopped describing what other people did. And had started describing what happened next. She pushed him. The words sat in the interrogation room like a stone dropped into still water. For hours, Thomas Grady had spoken carefully, keeping distance between himself and the violence of that night. He described arguments, strangers, confusion, everything circling around the moment Melissa Carter died without ever touching it directly. But now the story had shifted. The detective leaned forward slowly. Melissa pushed Tanner. Grady nodded faintly. Yeah. Why? I told you they were arguing. About money. Something like that. The detective waited. Silence often worked better than pressure. People filled silence with the things they were trying not to say. Grady stared at the table for several seconds before continuing. She told him to leave. And he didn't. The room felt heavier now. Because for the first time, Grady was describing an escalation, something investigators had always suspected but had never been able to prove. What did Tanner do when she pushed him? The detective asked. Grady rubbed his hands together slowly. He grabbed her arm. Hard. Yeah. Then what? Grady hesitated. His breathing had changed slightly, still controlled, but deeper. She slapped him. The detective's pen stopped moving. That detail had never appeared in any version of the investigation before. You saw that happen? Yes. And you stayed. Grady didn't answer immediately. Then he said something that sounded almost defensive. I didn't know what to do. The detective tilted his head slightly. So you watched? Grady nodded faintly. What happened next? Grady's eyes drifted toward the photograph of the living room again. The argument got louder. Did Tanner hit her? No. Did you? Grady shook his head quickly. No. The detective let the silence stretch again. Then he asked the question investigators had been circling all day. How did Melissa Carter end up on the floor? Grady closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something had shifted. The calm mask he'd worn for most of the interrogation had begun to crack. She shoved him again, he said. And Tanner? He snapped. Explain that. Grady's voice dropped lower. He grabbed her around the neck. The room fell completely silent. Manual strangulation. The exact cause of death listed in the autopsy report. How long? The detective asked quietly. Grady swallowed. I don't know. Seconds. No. Minutes. Another pause. Maybe. The detective leaned forward slightly. What were you doing while this was happening? Grady's fingers tightened against the edge of the table. I told him to stop. Did you try to pull him off? He hesitated. Then looked away. No. Inside the observation room, detectives exchanged glances. Because that answer changed everything. Watching someone strangle another person for minutes without intervening wasn't just inaction, it was participation through silence. The detective spoke again. Melissa Carter died from strangulation. Grady nodded faintly. You just told us you saw Tanner choking her. Yes. And you did nothing. Grady's jaw tightened. I was shocked. Shocked for several minutes. I didn't think he'd go that far. But he did. The detective slid the crime scene photo closer to him again. When Tanner finally let go, what did you see? Grady stared at the picture. She wasn't moving. Was she breathing? I don't know. Did you check? No. The detective leaned back slowly. So after watching a woman get strangled to death in front of you, you left the house. Grady didn't respond. You didn't call the police. No. You didn't call an ambulance. No. You didn't tell anyone. Grady's voice was barely above a whisper now. No. The silence inside the room was thick enough to feel. Because if Grady's version of events was true, the mystery of who killed Melissa Carter might already be solved. Michael Tanner. But Tanner had been dead for 22 years. And the only witness had stayed silent for nearly 3 decades. The detective folded his hands again. What did Tanner do after she stopped moving? Grady rubbed his forehead slowly. He stepped back. Did he say anything? No. Nothing. Just breathing hard. Then what? Grady's eyes drifted again toward the floor. He looked at me. And? He said we both needed to leave. The detective narrowed his eyes slightly. Why both? Grady didn't answer. Did you touch Melissa Carter? No. Did Tanner? I don't remember. The detective reached into the folder again and removed another photograph. This one had been taken during the autopsy. Bruising along Melissa's neck. Clear finger marks. 2 different pressure patterns were noted by the medical examiner, the detective said quietly. Grady looked up. What does that mean? It means the force applied to her neck changed during the attack. Grady's expression tightened slightly. People move when they struggle. That's true, the detective said. But medical examiners also noted something else. He slid the report across the table. There may have been more than one set of hands. The words landed like a thunderclap. Grady froze. For the first time since the interrogation began, real fear appeared on his face. That's not true, he said quickly. It's in the report. I didn't touch her. You're sure about that? Yes. Because strangulation takes time. The detective leaned forward again, his voice steady. And sometimes one person can't hold on long enough alone. Grady's breathing had changed again. Faster now. You're saying I killed her, he said. I'm saying the evidence suggests more than one person may have been involved. Grady shook his head rapidly. No. Then help us understand what happened. Grady looked down at the photograph of Melissa Carter's bruised neck. For nearly 30 years, the truth about that night had been buried in silence. Now the evidence was closing in from every direction. The second fingerprint. The DNA on the glass. The autopsy report. every piece pointing back to the two men who had been inside the house. Michael Tanner and Thomas Grady. The detective waited. Finally, Grady whispered something so quietly it almost disappeared under the hum of the lights. I tried to pull him off. The detective's eyes narrowed. That's not what you said earlier. Grady swallowed hard. I grabbed his arm. The story was shifting again. And this time, the shift placed Thomas Grady's hands dangerously close to the moment Melissa Carter died. Because if he truly had grabbed Tanner while Tanner was choking her, then the question investigators now faced was chilling. Had Thomas Grady been trying to stop a murder? Or had he been helping finish one? I tried to pull him off. The words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. For nearly 8 hours, Thomas Grady had walked a careful line inside the interrogation room, always close to the truth, but never fully stepping into it. Every detail he offered was just enough to explain the evidence without placing the blame squarely on himself. But now that line had shifted. Because the moment he admitted touching Michael Tanner during the strangulation, he had placed himself directly inside the most violent seconds of Melissa Carter's final moments. The detective leaned forward slowly. You grabbed his arm. Grady nodded faintly. Yes. Which arm? I don't remember. You just told us you tried to pull him off. I did. But you don't remember how? Grady's jaw tightened. It happened fast. The detective tapped the autopsy report again. Not that fast. Silence filled the room. Strangulation rarely happened in a sudden burst. Medical examiners had confirmed that Melissa Carter's death would have taken minutes, long, desperate minutes where a victim struggled for breath. And during those minutes, 2 men had been standing within arm's reach. The detective spoke quietly. When you grabbed Tanner's arm, did he stop? No. Did he look at you? Grady shook his head. He just kept going. And you let him. I told him to stop. But you didn't stop him. Grady rubbed his forehead again, frustration creeping into his voice. I didn't think she was going to die. The detective's eyes narrowed slightly. But she did. Another silence. Because the reality sitting in that interrogation room was brutal in its simplicity. Whether Grady had intended to help or not, he had stayed there while a woman died. The detective pushed further. When Tanner finally let go, what did he say? Grady hesitated. He said we needed to leave. You told us that already. He said the police would blame both of us. That sentence landed hard. The detective leaned forward again. Why would he say that? Grady didn't answer. Why would Tanner believe the police would blame you too? Grady's fingers curled against the edge of the table. I was there. That's not enough for murder. I touched him. Still not enough. The detective's voice lowered slightly. Unless something else happened. Grady's breathing had grown noticeably heavier now. Across the glass in the observation room, investigators watched every small movement carefully. Because something about the story still didn't make sense. If Tanner had been the one strangling Melissa, why would he suddenly worry about Grady being blamed? Unless. The detective spoke again. When Melissa Carter fell to the floor, did Tanner keep his hands on her neck? Grady froze for half a second. Then he said quietly. No. The detective's eyes sharpened. So at some point Tanner let go. Grady nodded slowly. Yes. And then what happened? The room seemed to grow smaller again. Grady stared at the crime scene photograph lying between them. She wasn't breathing right. What does that mean? Like gasping. The detective didn't interrupt. Grady continued. Tanner stepped back. And you? Grady swallowed. I knelt down. The words came out almost reluctantly. What did you do when you knelt down? The detective asked. Grady hesitated again. I checked her. For what? A pulse. Did she have one? I couldn't tell. The detective let a few seconds pass before asking the next question. And where were your hands while you were checking? Grady's eyes flicked upward briefly. Her neck. The room went completely silent. Because now the timeline had changed again. Michael Tanner had been strangling Melissa Carter. Then he stepped back. And Thomas Grady placed his hands on her neck. The detective's voice was very calm now. When your hands were on her neck, what were you doing? I told you. Checking her pulse. Did you press down? No. Did she move? I don't think so. Did she make a sound? Grady shook his head. No. The detective opened the autopsy report again. Medical examiners noted that pressure was applied in 2 phases. Grady didn't look up. The first phase caused initial unconsciousness. A pause. The second phase caused death. The detective slid the report closer. Those phases were separated by several seconds. Grady's breathing was louder now. What are you saying? He asked. The detective held his gaze. I'm saying the person who finished strangling Melissa Carter may not have been Michael Tanner. The words landed like a hammer. Grady's chair scraped slightly against the floor as he shifted. That's not true. Then explain something. The detective leaned forward again. If Tanner stepped away, why did Melissa Carter still die? Grady didn't answer. You told us she was gasping. Yes. That means she was still alive. The detective tapped the autopsy report again. So someone had to apply pressure again. Grady's hands trembled slightly now. It wasn't me. You were the only person touching her at that moment. I was checking her pulse. On her throat. That's where you check. The detective nodded slowly. That's correct. Another pause. But that's also exactly where someone would place their hands if they were finishing a strangulation. Grady's face had turned pale. For nearly 30 years he had lived quietly, blending into suburban life. But the story he was telling now was unraveling piece by piece. Because every new detail placed him closer to the exact moment Melissa Carter stopped breathing. The detective spoke again. What did Tanner do while you were kneeling next to her? Grady hesitated. He was pacing. Watching you? Yes. Did he say anything? Grady nodded faintly. What did he say? Grady's voice dropped to a whisper. He said, make sure she's out. The room fell into stunned silence. Inside the observation room, one detective leaned forward sharply. Because that sentence carried a meaning far darker than anything said so far. The detective in the interrogation room spoke slowly. What did you think he meant by that? Grady didn't respond. Did you push down harder? No. Did Tanner? No. Then how did Melissa Carter die? Grady stared at the photograph on the table. The image of the living room where everything had happened. The quiet suburban man who had spent decades hiding from that moment now looked like someone standing face to face with it again. And after nearly a full minute of silence, he whispered something that changed the entire story one more time. She grabbed my wrist. The detective leaned forward immediately. When? While I was checking her pulse. And? Grady's voice shook slightly now. She was still alive. Another pause. Barely. The detective's eyes narrowed. What did you do when she grabbed your wrist? Grady looked down at his hands. Hands that had lived an ordinary life for nearly 30 years. Hands that might have held the final seconds of someone else's life. Then he said quietly, Tanner told me not to let her scream. And suddenly the cold case that had haunted Florida since 1995 was no longer just about a man who watched a murder happen. It was about the possibility that the quiet suburban suspect had made a choice in that living room. A choice that turned a desperate, struggling victim into a silent one forever. The interrogation room had gone completely still. Detective Harris didn't rush the moment. Across the table, Thomas Grady sat motionless, staring at the autopsy report as if the words on the page had suddenly become heavier than he could carry. A few minutes earlier he had said something critical. I grabbed his arm. That was the first time in nearly 30 years that Grady had placed his own hands into the violent moment when Melissa Carter died. The detective spoke carefully. Thomas, earlier you told us you did nothing. Grady nodded faintly. Now you're saying you grabbed Tanner? Yes. Which one is the truth? Grady rubbed his face slowly. I panicked. People panic, the detective said calmly. But panic doesn't change what actually happened. Grady's breathing grew deeper. For hours he had tried to keep distance between himself and the murder. Now that distance was collapsing. What happened when you grabbed his arm? Harris asked. Grady stared at the table. He didn't let go. Did you pull harder? Yes. And Melissa? Grady swallowed. She was kicking. That detail matched the autopsy findings. Defensive injuries. Signs of struggle. So you tried to stop him, Harris said. Yes. But he kept choking her. Grady nodded. How long? I don't know. Minutes. The amount of time it takes for strangulation to become fatal. The detective turned another page in the report. Thomas, the medical examiner, said the pressure on her neck changed midway through the attack. Grady didn't respond. Almost like someone shifted position. Still nothing. Harris leaned forward. Did you ever put your hands on Melissa Carter? Grady's jaw tightened. No. Not even for a second? No. Because the bruising pattern suggests something else. Grady's fingers started tapping against the table. A nervous rhythm. The examiner believed one set of hands was applying pressure from the front, Harris continued. And another may have been pushing from behind. Grady looked up quickly. That's not what happened. Then tell me what did happen. Silence. In the observation room behind the glass, detectives watched Grady's body language change. His shoulders were collapsing inward. The calm suburban man they had picked up that morning was slowly disappearing. What did Tanner say when it was over? Harris asked. Grady's voice was thin now. He said she's not moving. Did you check her pulse? No. Did Tanner? No. You just left. Grady nodded. The detective let that sink in. A woman dying on the living room floor. 2 men standing over her. And both walking away. You know something, Thomas? Harris said quietly. What? People who try to stop murders usually call 911. Grady looked down. You didn't. No. You drove home. Yes. And then you lived the next 29 years like nothing happened. Grady didn't answer. Harris slid one final photograph onto the table. This one wasn't from 1995. It was from the day they arrested him. His quiet suburban home. Kids' bicycles on the lawn. A normal life. You built a whole life after Melissa Carter died, Harris said. Grady's eyes filled with moisture for the first time. I tried to forget. You don't forget something like that. The room went silent again. Finally Harris asked the question that had been hanging over the entire investigation. Did Michael Tanner kill Melissa Carter alone? Grady closed his eyes. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then he whispered. No. In the observation room, someone muttered under their breath. There it was. The first crack in the story. Harris didn't react. Tell me what you mean. Grady opened his eyes again, exhausted now. He started it. Started what? The choking. And you? Grady's voice shook. I tried to pull him off. That's not what the autopsy suggests. Grady stared at the bruising photo again. Finally he said the words detectives had suspected for decades. I pushed her shoulders down. Harris stayed perfectly still. So Tanner could keep his grip, he asked quietly. Grady nodded. The room seemed to shrink around them. For 29 years, the death of Melissa Carter had been an unsolved mystery. Now the truth was sitting in a small interview room. 2 men. One choking. One holding the victim down. Together. Why? Harris asked. Grady wiped his face. She was screaming. And we thought the neighbors would hear. The explanation was almost more disturbing than the crime itself. Not rage. Not revenge. Just fear of getting caught. So you held her down, Harris said. Yes. Until she stopped moving. Grady nodded slowly. And then you left her there. Another nod. Harris closed the folder. Thomas Grady, he said quietly, you just admitted to participating in the murder of Melissa Carter. Grady didn't argue. Didn't protest. Didn't try to take the words back. He simply sat there, staring at the table where the evidence had finally forced the truth out. Michael Tanner had died years earlier. But the second man in that living room had just confessed. After 29 years of silence, Melissa Carter's killer had finally been identified. And this time, he wasn't walking away. Thomas Grady's confession changed everything. Within hours of the interrogation ending, prosecutors moved quickly. For nearly 3 decades, the death of Melissa Carter had been classified as a cold case with too little evidence to move forward. But now detectives had something they had never had before. A direct admission from one of the 2 men inside the house the night she died. Even though Michael Tanner, the man who initiated the strangulation, had died years earlier, the law still allowed prosecutors to charge anyone who participated in the killing. And Grady had just admitted exactly that. He hadn't wrapped his hands around Melissa's neck. But he had done something that, legally, carried the same weight. He held her down. The charge. Within 2 days, Thomas Grady was formally charged with second-degree murder. Investigators believed the killing had not been premeditated, but the actions inside that living room clearly showed reckless disregard for human life. According to prosecutors, Tanner strangled Melissa Carter. Grady restrained her shoulders. Both men left without calling for help. Under Florida law, that made Grady a full participant in the homicide. The moment the charges were announced, the case that had sat quietly in old filing cabinets since 1995 exploded into national news. For the Carter family, it was the first real sense of justice they had felt in nearly 30 years. Melissa's younger sister spoke briefly outside the courthouse. She never got to grow up, she said. We spent our lives wondering who did this. Then she added something that stuck with many of the detectives who had worked the case. He went home and lived his life like nothing happened. The trial that followed. Grady's defense team tried to challenge the confession. They argued. He had been under intense interrogation. He was only trying to stop Tanner. His statements were misinterpreted. But prosecutors had something powerful. The autopsy report. The medical examiner's notes describing pressure from multiple directions around Melissa's neck matched Grady's eventual admission that he pushed her shoulders down. Detectives also presented fingerprints recovered from a drinking glass, newly tested DNA evidence from the crime scene, recorded portions of the interrogation. When jurors heard Grady say, "I pushed her shoulders down," the courtroom reportedly went silent. Because those words aligned perfectly with the forensic evidence. The verdict. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Thomas Grady was found guilty of second-degree murder. When the verdict was read, Melissa Carter's family quietly held hands in the gallery. No celebration. Just relief. For many of them, the verdict wasn't about punishment. It was about finally knowing what had happened. Sentencing. Because of the time that had passed and Grady's age, the sentencing phase drew intense attention. Prosecutors requested a long prison term, arguing that the decades he spent free were time Melissa Carter never had. The judge ultimately sentenced Grady to 25 years in prison. In his final statement before sentencing, Grady addressed the Carter family. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have stopped him." For Melissa Carter's family, the apology came almost 30 years too late. Why the case mattered. Investigators later said the case proved something important about modern forensic science. Evidence that had been sitting in storage since the 1990s could now be re-examined with new technology. In this case, it reopened a murder investigation that many believed would never be solved. One detective summed it up simply. Cold cases aren't dead. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right piece of truth to come out. And for Melissa Carter, that truth finally surfaced nearly 3 decades after the night she died in her own living room. The silence that protected her killers for so long was finally broken. Even after the verdict, the story didn't truly end. Cases like Melissa Carter's rarely do. Because when a crime sits unsolved for nearly 30 years, it leaves marks far beyond the courtroom. The detectives who refused to let it go. Several of the investigators who helped reopen the case had not even been police officers when Melissa Carter was killed in 1995. Some of them were still in school. Yet they ended up solving a mystery that had haunted an entire department for decades. One retired detective who had originally worked the case returned to the station after the verdict was announced. He stood quietly in the hallway where the evidence board used to hang. "For years," he said, "we thought we'd never get this one back." When the case was reopened, the old evidence boxes were pulled from storage. Inside were items that had sat untouched for decades. Photographs from the living room. Handwritten witness notes. The original autopsy report. A drinking glass that still held a fingerprint. Back in 1995, investigators didn't have the technology to extract everything those pieces of evidence contained. But in 2024, they did. What had once been a dead end became the starting point that eventually led them to Thomas Grady's front door. The quiet life that ended overnight. Neighbors in Grady's suburban neighborhood were shocked when the arrest happened. To them, he was simply the quiet man down the street. He waved when people walked their dogs. He mowed his lawn every Sunday morning. No one imagined that inside his past was a crime scene from nearly 3 decades earlier. One neighbor told reporters, "He never caused trouble. He just kept to himself." But investigators often say something unsettling about cold cases. People rarely look like the worst thing they've ever done. The Carter family's long wait. For Melissa Carter's family, the years between 1995 and the arrest felt endless. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Each year, the question remained the same. Who killed Melissa? Her parents kept her bedroom exactly the way it had been the last time she visited. Her sister said the hardest part wasn't the grief. It was the uncertainty. "You can mourn someone," she said during the trial. "But it's harder when you don't know the truth." When the guilty verdict was finally read, the family didn't cheer. They didn't cry loudly. They simply held each other. Because after 29 years, the question that had defined their lives finally had an answer. What the case changed. The Melissa Carter investigation later became a training example for homicide detectives. Not because the crime itself was unusual, but because of the way the truth eventually surfaced. The case showed 3 important lessons investigators often repeat. Evidence can outlive silence, even when witnesses stay quiet for decades. Forensic science keeps advancing. What cannot be tested today might be testable tomorrow. Time doesn't erase responsibility. A person can live an entire life before the truth catches up. The final reminder. Years after the case closed, one of the detectives who had interrogated Thomas Grady was asked what moment stayed with him the most. It wasn't the confession. It wasn't the verdict. It was something much quieter. During the interrogation, when Grady first admitted he had held Melissa Carter down, he said something almost under his breath. She wouldn't stop screaming. For nearly 30 years, those screams had existed only in the memories of the 2 men in that room. Now the truth behind them was finally part of the record. Melissa Carter's story no longer ended with a cold case file gathering dust. It ended with the truth. And sometimes, after decades of silence, that truth is the closest thing to justice a family will ever receive. Years after the trial ended, the story of Melissa Carter continued to echo in ways no one had expected. Not because of the crime itself, but because of what the case represented. The case that reopened other investigations. After Thomas Grady was convicted, the police department launched a full review of several other unsolved cases from the 1990s. Melissa Carter's investigation had proven something important. Old evidence could still speak. Boxes that had sat untouched in storage rooms for decades were reopened. Inside were items that had once seemed useless. Cigarette butts. Drinking glasses. Old clothing sealed in plastic. Partial fingerprints. With modern DNA technology, many of those pieces of evidence suddenly had value again. Detectives began re-examining files that had been labeled inactive for years. One investigator later said, "Melissa's case reminded us that time doesn't destroy evidence. Sometimes it just waits for better science." The Carter family's quiet mission. Melissa Carter's sister eventually began speaking publicly about cold cases. Not as a spokesperson or activist. Just as someone who had lived through the uncertainty. She often explained that the hardest part wasn't the loss itself. It was the not knowing. For nearly 30 years, their family had existed in a strange limbo. No answers. No arrests. Just questions. After the trial, she began attending community events where families of missing or murdered loved ones gathered. Her message was simple. Don't give up on the truth. Because her sister's case had proven something rare but powerful. Justice can arrive late. But it can still arrive. The lesson detectives carried forward. For the detectives who worked the case, one moment from the interrogation remained unforgettable. When Thomas Grady finally admitted what he had done, he didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply whispered. "I pushed her shoulders down." Such a small sentence. Yet it carried the weight of an entire murder. One investigator later said that confession changed how younger detectives approached cold cases. Instead of assuming silence meant the truth was lost forever, they learned something different. Sometimes silence is just fear. And fear can crack. The final record of the case. Today, Melissa Carter's case file is no longer marked unsolved. Instead, it sits in the department archives under a different label. Solved, Cold Case Homicide. Inside the file are hundreds of pages documenting the investigation. Crime scene photos. Witness interviews. The autopsy report. And the transcript of the interrogation that finally revealed the truth. But the last page in the file is much simpler. It contains a short summary written by the lead detective after the trial. The final line reads, "After 29 years, the truth about Melissa Carter's death was established. One suspect deceased. One convicted. The memory that remains. Melissa Carter was 26 years old when she died. Friends remembered her as someone who laughed easily and talked loudly when she was excited. Someone who filled a room with energy. For decades, her story had been reduced to a police file and an unsolved mystery. Now it was something else. A reminder that time does not erase the truth. Sometimes it only delays the moment when the truth finally catches up. And in this case, it took 29 years for that moment to arrive. But when it did, Melissa Carter was no longer just a cold case. She was finally a solved one. Long after the trial ended and the headlines faded, the story of Melissa Carter continued to be told. Not because it was the most violent case investigators had ever seen, but because it showed how close the truth can live to ordinary life. For nearly 30 years, Thomas Grady lived quietly. He had neighbors. He had routines. He built a life that looked completely normal from the outside. Yet hidden inside that life was a night in 1995 that had never been answered. A night when a woman died in a living room while two men stood there. One choking her. The other holding her down. And then both walking away. The power of time in cold cases. Detectives often say that time works in strange ways in criminal investigations. At first, it seems like time helps suspects. Memories fade. Witnesses move away. Evidence grows old. But sometimes time begins to work in the opposite direction. Technology improves. Old evidence can be tested again. And people who have carried secrets for decades start to feel the weight of them. In Thomas Grady's case, it wasn't just the DNA evidence or the fingerprints that brought investigators back to him. It was also the pressure of telling the same story for nearly 30 years. Eventually, the story cracked. And when it did, the truth came out in a single sentence. "I pushed her shoulders down." The moment justice finally arrived. When the verdict was read in court, Melissa Carter's family didn't describe the feeling as victory. They called it closure. Not perfect closure. Nothing could return the years they lost. Nothing could bring Melissa back. But for the first time since 1995, they knew exactly what had happened inside that house. No more wondering. No more guessing. Just the truth. Why the story continues to matter. Cold cases are often seen as mysteries that fade into the background. But investigators know something different. Every cold case represents a family still waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for someone to reopen the file. Waiting for a piece of evidence that was once useless to suddenly become important. Melissa Carter's case became a reminder that even the oldest cases can still move forward. Even after decades. Even after suspects believe they are safe. The final line in the story. Today, the house where Melissa Carter died looks like any other home. New families have lived there. The living room has been repainted. The furniture is long gone. Nothing about it suggests that it was once the center of a murder investigation. But inside the police archives, the file remains. Not as a mystery anymore. Just as a record of something that took nearly 30 years to uncover. A crime. A secret. A confession. And the moment when the truth finally caught up with the man who helped hide it. Because in the end, the thing about cold cases is simple. They aren't really gone. They're just waiting for the day someone finally finishes the story. In the years after the case was closed, Melissa Carter's story slowly moved from headlines into history. But for the people connected to it, the memory never really faded. The detective's last reflection. The lead detective who helped secure Thomas Grady's confession retired not long after the trial. On his final day, he was asked during a small farewell gathering which case had stayed with him the most. He didn't hesitate. Melissa Carter. Not because it was the most complicated investigation. Not because it involved the most evidence. But because it proved something he believed every investigator should remember. A case is only truly over when the truth is known. For 29 years, that truth had been hidden in silence. Then one day, inside a quiet interrogation room, the silence broke. What happened to Thomas Grady? Thomas Grady began serving his sentence shortly after the trial concluded. By that time, he was far older than the man who had stood in Melissa Carter's living room in 1995. The years between the crime and the conviction had allowed him to build a life most people assumed was ordinary. But the justice system doesn't measure responsibility by how long someone avoids it. When the sentence was handed down, the judge said something that would later be quoted in news reports about the case. You had nearly 3 decades to tell the truth. You chose silence. The family's quiet peace. Melissa Carter's family never tried to keep the story in the public spotlight. Once the trial ended, they stepped away from interviews and attention. For them, the most important part had already happened. They finally knew the answer to the question that had followed them for most of their lives. Who killed Melissa? The answer was no longer speculation. It was written into the official record. The truth about cold cases. Many people assume that unsolved cases eventually disappear. But investigators know something different. Cold cases don't disappear. They sit quietly in storage rooms, waiting. Waiting for new technology. Waiting for a witness to speak. Waiting for someone who has carried a secret for years to finally slip and say the wrong thing. That's what happened in the Melissa Carter case. One small sentence changed everything. I pushed her shoulders down. With those 4 words, a mystery that lasted nearly 30 years finally ended. The story that remains. Melissa Carter was only 26 years old when she died. Her life ended inside a living room where 2 men made a decision they believed they would never have to answer for. For decades, it seemed like they were right. But time has a way of catching up. Evidence waits. Memories shift. And sometimes the truth surfaces in the quietest possible place, an interrogation room, with a single sentence that can no longer be taken back. In the end, Melissa Carter's case became more than just another solved homicide. It became a reminder of something investigators often say to families who are still waiting for answers. Cold cases are not forgotten. Sometimes they are simply waiting for the moment when the truth finally finds its way out.